All right, welcome to the second lecture for the Introduction to British Lit. Today I'm going to be talking about the history of the English language and how, kind of tracing its history, its origin over time, and how that relates to us today in the English that we speak. I want to begin, I guess, maybe at the beginning, maybe not the beginning, because before it was inhabited, before it was conquered, Britain was a very wild land, and they spoke a Celtic language that you can still hear today if you visit Ireland or Scotland or Wales. But we're going to actually start during the 5th century, the latter part of the 5th century, and how our English language, the beginnings of our English language then. So in the latter part of the 5th century, there were a group of tribes that invaded. They were Germanic. They invaded Britain, and they were called the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Okay, and they collectively became known as the Anglo-Saxons. I don't know what happened to the Jutes. I guess they were the weaker tribe and kind of got pushed, the name got pushed out. They didn't get to be included in the title. So they invaded Britain. They crossed the North Sea from Denmark and northern Germany, what we know today is Denmark and northern Germany. And they named this new territory England, okay, which is where we get England from. And it literally meant the land of the Angles. And so they pushed those inhabitants of Britain, those native inhabitants, they pushed them west and north into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, where they still speak that Celtic language that we talked about a few minutes ago. And so these invading tribes, these Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, they all spoke a very similar language, which they developed into a common language that they called English, which is where our term English derives from. Okay, so 450 to 1100 AD, these similar language, they become known as what we now call Old English, and you can see it there in the middle of your screen. It's a runic alphabet, an Anglo-Saxon runic alphabet. That's our first English alphabet. Something very interesting is that about half the words that we use today in modern English have Old English roots, and so we get a lot of our vocabulary, half essentially, from that original Anglo-Saxon runic alphabet. Okay, so in 1066, the Normans came. They were led by William the Conqueror, and he invaded and conquered Britain. And basically, when he took over during the time of the 1100 to about 1500 AD, the upper classes began to speak a French-infused English. Most of the upper class, the people that had access to education, spoke French. But the lower classes, they didn't have access. There were no books. There was no printing press invented at the time, and so literacy would only have been spread orally from place to place. So the lower classes, they had no access to education, no access to text, and they continued to speak Old English. And that upper class began to speak French, and as a result, it blended together into a French-infused English that we now call Middle English. So rolling on into the 1500s, so actually Canterbury, the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, was a very important text that was written during the Middle English time period, and as a result of its popularity, English became the dominant language again. The upper classes began to speak English again. We pushed the French out, and now we are back into what we now call the early modern period, about 1500s to 1800s. This is going to be the time of Shakespeare, the time of a lot of great changes in Europe in general. We had the Renaissance that was happening at the time in Italy, and it filtered over into Britain. And so you have a lot of things happening to our language at the time. The first thing that happened was something that was called the Great Vowel Shift. Okay, and so this change in pronunciation led to vowels began sounding shorter and shorter, and so as a result, many new words and phrases entered the language. The second thing that happened that was very significant was the invention of printing. So you had the Gutenberg press, and now there was a common language that was in print. So your spelling and your grammar become fixed, and your London dialect became the standard dialect of English. And the first English dictionary was published in 1604. Now, that didn't help anybody that still didn't have access to education, and books at the time, because they were so expensive to print. They didn't spread widespread because people didn't have the financial ability to collect a lot of books like they do now. You can just run to Second and Charles, which is my mothership, and you can pick up a bunch of books, and that just wasn't the case. And so you either couldn't afford the texts if you could read them, or if you could afford them and you had no access to education, that kind of thing. So it didn't really become widespread until the cost of printing came down and texts were able to spread a little bit more easily that way. So this is kind of like where, in this period, is where our American English kind of stops evolving on the Britain side, right? Because we started developing colonies, and we left Britain at the time, and so as a result, our English is more like the English of Shakespeare than it is the late modern, which is currently spoken in Britain today. So I find that very interesting. Shakespeare developed a ton of, or who we think is Shakespeare, the man behind our men. There's a lot of theories out there that Shakespeare was a collective work by many different people, or it could have just been one man, but he contributed greatly to the language. And so that's very interesting that our American English is more like the language of Shakespeare than it is late modern, which started at about 1800 and is still considered to be spoken today in Britain. So the major difference in this English and the early modern English is really the vocabulary. So you had a couple of things that were happening. You had the Industrial Revolution. Cities like Birmingham and Manchester were springing up, big factory cities. They were bringing in new technology. When I say technology at the time, we're talking about factory equipment and things like that. And so they needed vocabulary to be able to express the terms that were needed for the processes that they were working on in those factories. And so the Industrial Revolution created a lot of new words entering into the vocabulary. The second thing that happened during this period of time was that the British Empire kind of went on tour, right? They started collecting countries, island nations, and things like that underneath their umbrella. And as a result, they borrowed a lot of foreign words from places like Australia and India and your island countries as well. And so that is the development there. So a little bit about us before we kind of close with this is our colonization. You know, when we came, so we started colonizing around 1600. Obviously, they landed on Plymouth Rock and all this good stuff. And so there were already people here in North America that we borrowed a lot of words from. You had the Spanish and French that were already here. The French lived in places like Louisiana, down a lot of fur trappers and traders, and they were working on those waterways. The Spanish were already here. We got the Native American languages. We got a lot of influence. We have a lot of influence from them because we borrowed a lot of words for things that we didn't have words for. And then you also had the influence of the South African languages, which we got from slaves that were being brought into the United States. And so we talked about our English is kind of more like the English of Shakespeare, but it also is a blend of all of those different types of languages that we borrowed from the people that were already living here in America. So if you've got some time, make sure that you check out the history of the English language in 10 minutes. It's a 10-minute little spiel on the evolving nature of our English, and it goes all the way up to modern day, where we're getting information from like the 70s when the the World Wide Web kind of broke onto the scene and how that has continued to evolve over time. It's a really interesting little video that you'll enjoy, and it kind of just gives a little bit more clarity to the things that I've talked about in today's lecture.